everyone. I'm Ritesh, and so I'll walk you through some of the interesting things that are happening in the enterprise ecosystem, right? We call it the Great OS Migration because it is one of the biggest transformations that have happened within the enterprise space. So for example, for a decade or longer, we were Microsoft house, and then over the last I would say 6 years or so, now things have started to migrate into Android. So what I'll cover today is, I'll talk about, consumer versus enterprise, what really happened from a consumer perspective that is influencing enterprise, right? We'll see a lot of interesting trends and patterns. We'll talk about what happened with Microsoft, right? Where Microsoft future direction has gone from an operating system perspective. We'll talk about how Android came into existence, especially for enterprise, right? Because as you can imagine, Android is a consumer operating system, right? It was never actually designed to be an enterprise-grade operating system. It was designed to be a consumer operating system. So there's a lot of stuff that Zebra did, to make that consumer operating system into an enterprise-grade operating system. So we'll talk about, some of the Zebra's strategies, some portfolio, and what the number one concern that comes with Android is about security, right? People have heard about stage fright or heartbleed or all of these scary acronyms, right? When it comes to security with Android, and so we'll talk a little bit about what Zebra is doing in that regards. The data that I'm going to share with you, right? This is not Ritesh's data, by the way, right? This is data that we have collected from our ISVs, from industry analysts, financial analysts, Google enterprise market data, Zebra's financial data, a lot of this stuff, right? And my intention here is to essentially show you patterns and trends that are happening in the environment today, and essentially kind of give you the background as to why this transformation happened, right? And essentially realize the logic behind why Google essentially is the leading operating system now, especially when it comes to the enterprise space. As we go along, please ask questions, right? There's tons of stuff I can go into, so it's actually good that we go into tangents, right? So that's please ask away any questions. So let's get started. So we know that change is happening, right? Across all four verticals, there is constant new things happening. By the way, this is data from Gartner, IDC, and McKinsey, right? In healthcare, for example, 30% of hospitals are now running on real-time healthcare systems. What that means is that there is an inherent need for real-time access to patient data, right? The same kind of a pattern in retail, right? 15% of retail sales occur online, right? If you look at the Black Friday, for example, more and more people do their shopping online for Black Friday, right? This is where buy online, pick up in store became very, very popular, right? Here's another interesting trend that we'll see in 1 second, that now more and more expectation is to have a delivery of a product in the 2 days, right? Even 2 days is considered as slow. In fact, we were just looking at this example with Amazon. Amazon looks at your past data and trends, and it can actually send the stuff to you before you actually even order it. Think about that for a second, right? So they have the ability to predict with such accuracy that what kind of product that you would need before you actually even order it. So it is available in the closest distribution center. So when you do order it, it's literally a day away, right? So that is again changing the ecosystem quite a bit. In manufacturing, 42% of global workforce are mobile workforces, right? Again, that is a huge impact from the more demand on mobile devices or getting data readily available to those workers in the workforce. Same thing in TNL, right? Travel, transportation and logistics. That 15% of shipments are instant delivery, right? Few years ago, when Amazon was talking about using drones for doing delivery, right? Everyone said that, drones. Actually, give it another 6 months, that will become a real reality, right? Where what Amazon is looking at is that, okay, there is a truck that shows up in the neighborhood and it goes and delivers using drones, everything, within a 1 mile radius, right? So that changes the ecosystem again. Now, there is a fundamental baseline in each one of these verticals, which is access to data, right? Real-time access to data, enabling the workforce to be able to very quickly get access to that data and be able to look at patterns and trends, be able to act upon it, right? You have probably heard from Zebra about Sense, Analyze, Act, which applies to each one of these things. And we'll go deeper into it as we go along. By the way, a lot of this stuff is e-commerce, which is driving these pieces behind the scenes. So, for example, over $4 trillion by 2020 in e-commerce, right? Now think about what that is driving, be it from the shopper experience and expectations, be it from the cost of transportation and labor, or in fact even labor shortage. Again, each one of these different these trends basically go back to the same fundamental thing, that we need to enable the worker to be able to have fast and efficient access to that data. Okay, now how did we get here? So if you look at some of the signposts, so I'll talk about when you think about Android and you look at the market in general, we'll look at some of the patterns and trends which have led to where we are today. So first one is when you think about the overall market for mobile devices, there are about 1.5 billion devices out there. This includes consumer devices, this includes enterprise devices, tablets, everything, right? There are about 1.5 billion devices out there. Now, we can break them into personal only devices, like your own personal phones, right? Or BYOD, so bring your own device, or COPE, which is corporate owned, personal enabled, or COBO, which is corporate owned business only. Now, if you think about the COBO and COPE, these are basically corporate liable devices, right? Which means that the corporate or the organization is paying for those devices, whereas personal phones or BYOD, those are essentially individuals' responsibility, right? So now, if you look at the split of this market, right, this is where you see Apple, Samsung, BlackBerry, HTC, other consumer phones and devices which are there, right? And these devices, they equate to about 219 million units per year, right, in the consumer space. Anything that is in the COPE space, which is corporate-owned, personal-enabled, that's about 115 million. And COBO, which is where we play, is about 5 million devices a year. Okay, now when you think about the consumer side of the fence, that is more about using your personal device for your personal use, right? But anything that is on the corporate side, COPE, BYOD, that's a typo, it's BYOD. These devices are essentially shorter life cycles. They are designed predominantly for a consumer operating system, right? They are very similar to what you would expect from a closed platform and such. But now, if we look at the enterprise space, right, the COBO market, which is about 5 million devices, this is where our ecosystem comes into play, right? This is the enterprise ecosystem, not just Zebra, but everyone. Now, the thing that I would ask you to remember is 5 million units a year, right? Compared to the 219 million units a year, right? So huge difference. So keep that pattern in mind, right? So when you think about where Microsoft or Google or any of these operating system vendors were to go after, they're going after about 5 million units per year in enterprise, right? Versus 219 million units otherwise. Make sense? Okay. So now, if you think about this as a pattern, just keep in mind what kind of a market share that Microsoft or Apple or Google are going after in the enterprise space. And this actually story will be clear in another minute as to what happened with Microsoft and why they decided to shift a little bit here. Now, here's another interesting pattern that we've seen. This is something we call confluence, which is the consumer influence over enterprise. Let me just ask a show of hands. How many people remember these old, Motorola Zebra symbol devices, right? MC67, MC55. These devices, they were all like rugged key-based devices, right? But then, if you notice that more and more of our devices, have gone into more like a consumer-type device, right? There is no physical key on it, right? They are pocket. You can put them in your pocket example, right? They can be customer branded. We have moved away from hard keys to all touch keys, right? We have gone from resistive touchscreens. Remember, these used to be resistive touchscreens where you could use a stylus and literally poke the screen on it, right? And it still won't work. All the way across to capacitive and all-weather touch type devices. If you look at, and oh, by the way, larger displays, right? If you remember, these devices used to be like 2.8-inch screens, right? We had this one device which was called ES400, right? That was the biggest display that we had, right? And that display, if anyone wants to take a guess how big that was? That was about 3 inches, right? And we were like super stoked that, wow, we have a 3-inch display, right? And then you realize that now the more and more display sizes that we come up with, they are much larger display sizes, right? So what has happened is that the consumer influence, right? Be it iPhone or Android devices or Samsung or whatever, that has made its way into enterprise, right? So we see this again as a big shift in the industry that has happened. Now, why is this important, right? So when you think about the legacy operating systems, the key-based operating systems this side, these are all Microsoft-based operating systems, right? The newer operating systems on this side, right, which are more consumer-friendly operating systems, are predominantly Android or iOS or even BlackBerry, right? Those are the predominant operating system. Now, Microsoft went in that direction with Windows Phone, right? That was their operating system play to go into this consumer side. Here's another interesting pattern, right? So we obviously saw, that the transformation from keys and big, thick devices into, much more slimmer and much more consumer-type devices. But that also comes at a price, right? So for example, enterprise, while they want, consumer look and feel and, slim and trim devices, right? If you look at some of the devices right there, like TC51, or in fact, even the TC20, right? They look very much like, what your consumer device would look like, for example, right? But here is a challenge. Now, from an enterprise perspective, enterprise guys, they still expect, the ability to be able to have full access to roadmap. So if you think about consumer devices, right, no one has any view or knowledge of what Apple is going to introduce in their next OS, or in fact, even for that matter, what Google is going to do from their roadmap perspective. It's very important for enterprises to ensure that there is no theft or shrinkage of the products, right? Because, again, if you have a consumer device in an enterprise, what's the first thing that happens? It grows legs, right? And it runs before you know it. Multi-user, right? This is another big component in enterprise, right? Because you do not want, your consumer device is designed only to be used by you, right? The consumer. In enterprise, that doesn't work, right? I cannot have one device for every worker, right? I need that device to be able to use by multiple people. So the point is that these are the requirements, which are basically influenced from an enterprise perspective into an operating system. Now, why is this relevant? So when you think about even when Android went into the enterprise space, when we started working with Android, it was never designed to be an enterprise operating system, which means that Android did not have the ability to do multi-user, right? Zebra actually added that with MX, right? That enabled the ability to have multiple users. Same thing from Lifecycle perspective or Wi-Fi support perspective, right? Any kind of encryption and such, right? Zebra added those kind of components into the base Android operating system using MX. But keep this pattern in mind, right? That when you look at the operating system side, there is this expectation that the enterprise has on the device portfolios. Now, this is another interesting pattern, right? So we used to have the physical keys, right? We were just looking at a MC33 somewhere back there, right? I think you were looking at that, right? Which was all physical keys and going into, virtual keys. We actually did an analysis where we gave out these workers devices which were physical keys and, virtual keys. We actually saw a 39% improvement in efficiency, right? That those same workers were able to enter data a lot faster and 60% lower rate than the physical keyboard. Why is that? One reason is that they are so used to using their consumer devices, right? You think about the workforce that is using those devices. They are very much used to using their consumer iPhones or Samsungs to be able to do data entry and such, right? So it's the same kind of a mindset that applies there. Now, of course, blind entry is still a challenge, right? We still haven't figured out as to how to make that happen, right? But there is haptic feedback and things like that. My point again is that when you think about the transformation that the enterprise is going through a transformation of going from physical to virtual keys. Okay. Now, here is an interesting example here, right? In some of our traditional use cases, right? This example is actually under the wing example, right? So this was actually for, I believe it was for United at TC75. Under the wing operation is always a physical key, right? Because they are wearing gloves, or they are in a wet environment or whatever the case may be, right? We have seen that kind of transformation that has gone actually from physical to virtual, right? So again, remember this as a pattern, right? So that people are going from using consumer devices, they're getting more and more familiar using those consumer devices, right? Versus how the legacy operating systems work. Let me pause there for a second before I go into Android and see if that actually made sense. Any questions or thoughts? Yes?
What was the average age of the users that were tested on these?
So in that one, that was about, the average was about 28 to 35. That was the range, right? So now obviously, anyone who's in the little bit elder generation, they actually were also able to pick up very quickly. Zebra actually offers something called enterprise keyboard. So what we have done in that is, based on the kind of data that you have to enter, we only show those keys. So if you think about, like your phone, right? It shows you the full alphanumeric keyboard, right? Well, if I'm only entering 1, 2, 3, 4, why should I see that entire thing, right? So that enterprise keyboard actually makes a lot of sense, because now you're only seeing the data that you have to enter. Okay, all right. Any other thoughts? Nope. Okay, so let's talk about road to Android. What really happened with Android? So Microsoft, well, we've all used Microsoft, right? So from the beginning of time, and I say beginning of time, we used to use DOS, right? Back in the 90s, and well, yes, it was all DOS-based devices, right? In fact, the funny thing is that you can still go to some 7-Elevens and still find old legacy symbol devices running DOS. It's a real fun support instance, right? Because customers will come and say that, hey, do you know how to fix this product? And we say, well, okay, the guy who used to know DOS is no longer here, right? So what happened with Microsoft, right? So for the last decade, right, enterprises bought over 15 million mobile units running Windows operating system, right? Windows or Microsoft operating system was the de facto operating system, right? Be it Windows Mobile, Windows CE, right? As you know that there were two flavors of the operating system. Now, what Microsoft essentially decided is that they would basically retire the mainstream support for all of the operating system by, as you can see, 2012, 2016, 2013, 2015, and then essentially any of the extended support to be gone by 2021 and 2020. Okay, so what does that mean? So that means that Microsoft will not provide any more new features, and they will not provide any security patches, right? So now from an enterprise perspective, that's a problem, right? Because if you have any security breaches that happened, right, and there is a retailer that whose name starts with T, right? I won't tell you who they are. They had a hack a few years ago, right? Where in their payment terminals, people were able to extract, the credit card information of the users, right? When they looked at all of the root cause, it was because of a Windows XP machine, which was not, it did not have all the security patches on it, right? So this becomes a problem, a concern from enterprise perspective. Now, from a historical perspective, what Microsoft essentially tried to do, and remember I showed you the numbers, 219 million versus 5 million, right? Microsoft decided to place a bet that said that, okay, they will try to create a consumer operating system, which is basically Windows Phone. And the logic was that once the Windows Phone comes to life, they would take the guts of Windows Phone and apply it towards enterprise. Okay. We will see that in the next slide as to what happened there. But essentially, that did not work out very well, right? And ultimately, Microsoft essentially decided that the support for the legacy operating system is going to end. Okay, so what does that mean for people who are already on Microsoft operating systems, right? So now it's a fork in the road, right? You can either continue to stay with Microsoft or decide to look at some other alternatives. Now, this is not a simple decision, right? I call it as a career-changing move, right? To go from people who go from Windows to Android, right? Because it's a pretty significant shift, that happens. But let me show you a couple of other patterns and see if I can change some thought process as to, why Microsoft did this. So, by the way, Microsoft officially ends support for Windows Phone, right? This was a news article that came out actually last year in July, when Microsoft finally said that the Windows Phone version, which was supposed to be the kernel or the base operating system that they were going to use for enterprise, that is no longer going to be alive, right? So that essentially, for all intensive purposes, it says that that is the end of the line for that. By the way, Microsoft will continue to sell the licenses even beyond 2021 and 2020, right? But they just will not provide any security patches and updates. Okay, now, some other fun news to look at, what is going on from Microsoft side. Bill Gates, everyone knows who Bill Gates is, right? He now uses an Android phone. Bill Gates was actually, the biggest proponent for Windows Phone, but Windows Phone has been dead for a good year now, right? Bill Gates spotted by Microsoft Edition Samsung Galaxy S8 handheld with bundle software, right? This is actually a news article that came out last year, where Bill Gates officially said that, yes, they are moving. Microsoft gives up on Windows 10 Mobile, right? Windows 10 Mobile was essentially expected to be the last surviving instance of the Microsoft OS, right? The idea was that with Windows 10 Mobile, there was some sort of hope that, Microsoft might be able to revive it. When Microsoft gave up on that news, that definitely came as a pretty big surprise. Rest in peace, Windows Phone. New Windows 10 Mobile hardware and features aren't the focus, right? So all of these are signposts. Remember, I said in the beginning that I will show you the patterns, right, and let you decide, as to which direction you think, the ecosystem is going. Now let's look at another interesting pattern. This data is actually from 2016, and I deliberately used 2016 because then I'll show you the pattern from 2016 to 2017 and today. In 2016, there were about 1.2 billion devices. And this, by the way, this data actually comes from IDC, right? So this is not Zebra's data, right? This is IDC data. And according to them, 81% of the devices running, this is worldwide, by the way, was running on Android. With iOS at about 15.8%, Microsoft at about 2.2%, right? So now, if you think about, the playground that Microsoft had was 2% compared to 81%, right? So it doesn't take a lot of calculation here to realize that it will take a massive amount of effort for Microsoft to be able to, take away this market share. Okay, now another report, which was that Android will have 83% of global mobile market share by 2019, right? This was actually a prediction in 2015, and I'll show you where it is today. But now, if you look at this data, this was by the Q1 of 2016, Microsoft's share had dropped to 0.7%. So if you are Microsoft, right, think about this, that can you really grow a business from 0.7% to 81%? Not likely, right? That would require basically a monumental effort, right? So what did Microsoft say? Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, Windows Phone market share is unsustainable, right? So this was their own saying that, okay, the operating system from their Microsoft's own perspective is not something that they can go after. Here was another interesting metric, that was in Q1 of 2016, it was a minus 73% year-over-year drop, right? So if you think from the Microsoft executive perspective, right, you have a declining market share and a decline in the unit sales. By the way, Microsoft Lumia, everyone knows what Lumia is, right? This was the Nokia brand that Microsoft purchased. Anyone remembers how much they paid for it?
A lot.
It was, if I remember right, it was $2 billion, right? That Nokia's buyout from Microsoft. That has to hurt, right? When you have spent $2 billion and find a minus 73% year-over-year decline. Okay, so that's one pattern. Now, this is a little bit more recent data, right? So in 2016, by the way, this actually was data that we collected from multiple different places, right? So you'll see that between 2014 and 2017, the Android market share in enterprise went from 11% to 38%, right? This is the number of devices that are being shipped out. At the same time, you see the decline on the Windows platforms as well. By the way, on Zebra devices today, 45% of our devices are still shipped on Windows, right? And then the rest is running on Android, right? So that's again a pretty big shift for us. But if you look at where 2020 and 2019 and 2020 goes, you can see that majority of the market share that we project is going to be running Android operating system. Okay, now let's look at another interesting pattern. Now the signs that Microsoft has embraced Android. So if you notice that Microsoft solutions like Active Directory, Exchange, ActiveSync, Cloud, all of these things now support Android, right? They inherently natively support Android. If you remember, Active Directory was designed specifically for Microsoft devices, right, and Microsoft platforms. So Microsoft has obviously, gone in a different direction, right? Here's another interesting pattern: Visual Studio, right? Everyone, okay? If you haven't heard of Visual Studio is the tool that used to be used by developers for creating Microsoft applications. Microsoft essentially announced that Visual Studio can be now used to create Android applications, right? Again, huge shift, right? Because now Microsoft is basically saying is that the number one tool that's used to create Microsoft applications can now be used to create Android applications, right? So you see another interesting pattern that's out there. Here's another interesting line that I picked up, from one of the news article, that Satya Nadella saying that trying to get to a world where device matters less than the service it is accessing. So to me, that kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into where Microsoft thinking is, right? They are going more and more towards a services kind of a play, right? Versus an operating system or devices, right? So again, a pattern. Now, this was another interesting one. Now, this is from 2016, that Lenovo will preload Microsoft Office, Skype, and OneDrive on its Android devices, right? So you can see that Microsoft is still, going more towards services play than actual operating system play. Here's another interesting pattern, right? So there are 106 published applications from Microsoft which are on Google Play Store today. So think about it, right? So Microsoft have all of these applications which are designed to run on Android. Now here's another interesting pattern. If you look at this note up on top, this actually came from Forbes, that Microsoft takes $6 billion from Android, right? This is basically the royalty that Microsoft got for all of the patents that that Android is using. So now think about it. So remember, I said you had 5 million devices here, right? At the max, right? That's in the enterprise space. If you're Microsoft, you're still making $6 billion from patents. That's a losing market. Do you still believe that you should invest in creating an operating system or extending the life of it, right? That's the question to be answered, right? The logical answer will come in in a second there as well. But the interesting thing is that Microsoft actually, this was an interesting one too. Microsoft Garage releases 3 new business productivity apps for Android. This is another indication that Microsoft is very much embracing the the fact that, okay, it does not matter what operating system is running behind the scenes, right? As long as they can offer services and tools and software applications that they can charge, right? Does it matter, what it's running behind the scenes, right? Okay, so when we look at Zebra, because Zebra has also gone through a big transformation, right? If you notice, this is a picture of an aircraft carrier, because it was literally like moving an aircraft carrier for Zebra, right? Because we were 100%, Microsoft, right? And for us to, make that U-turn was a pretty lengthy cycle. So when we started out in 2014, you can see that majority of our devices were running on Microsoft platforms, right? By the time we come to 2017, we are more than half of our device portfolio is running on Android, right? Same thing as you see from a projection perspective, that we will continue to see a huge increase of more and more devices running on Android. If you notice that all of the new products that come from Zebra now, they are all running Android, right? We have not launched, or we do not have any plans of creating any new devices running on Windows at this point, right? By the way, this trend is applicable to all of the verticals, right? So it's not just retail, but it's across the board, right? And we are seeing customers who are really embracing the operating system from that perspective. So from Zebra's side, Zebra was the first one to essentially embrace Android, and we went after. We've been doing it for 6 years, and Zebra actually owns about more than 60% market share in enterprise for Android, right? Okay, and of course we have more than 11 products at this point, that are running on Android. Now, just to compare, from a shipment perspective, you'll notice that broken down by verticals, we again see a huge shift going from from Windows to Android, right? So just if you see that, in 2016, 42% of our devices shipped were running on Android, right? 2017, that was 54%, right? So we again see a huge shift that is happening in the direction of more and more people choosing Android. By the way, if we look at Zebra's device roadmap, right? We started out with very first tablet in 2011 on Android, and then we moved towards our handheld devices with MC40 and TC55, and now with TC56 and 57 and 52, that will come about. But also extending the portfolio of Android into all of our other devices, right? So not just tablet and durable devices, but same for rugged devices, as well as specialized devices like the CC5000, which is a kiosk, concierge kiosk device, all the way to a personal shopper device, to a wearable device that you see in the back over there, going across to vehicle mount devices, right? So, and this is all being driven by the customer demands and customer requirements, right? In fact, we have forged a relationship with Qualcomm, right? So where Qualcomm, by the way, Qualcomm is the same chipset manufacturer, that provides chips for the consumer devices, right? So our partnership with Qualcomm essentially enables us to stay ahead of the curve, on the latest chipset side. Now, I talked about what Zebra is doing, but if you look at what some of our other friends are doing in the market, right? So you'll see that Honeywell is also beginning to move into the Android ecosystem, right? They have about 12.8% market share. But if you notice, right, Zebra is over here, right? By the way, this data is from VDC, but you'll see that the ecosystem of other players in enterprise have also adopted Android, right? They are also moving more and more towards Android. Now, there are people like Bluebird, for example, right? Who are still on the Microsoft bandwagon, right? And you can see that 55% of their market share is going towards Windows 8 side, right? Which this is still yet to be seen as to what will happen with it, right? Especially with Windows 10 IoT, there is an expectation that Microsoft might do something, but all the trends and signposts that we have seen say otherwise, right? As to what Microsoft really will do with that. By the way, in Android, there is something called Google Mobile Services, right? Which is what Google really pushes for, right? Because so Google provides two flavors of operating systems, right? One is an open source project, AOSP, and another one is Google Mobile Services. AOSP, anyone is allowed to use AOSP and download, install, whatever you want to do with it. But GMS essentially provides capabilities such as Google Maps, Gmail, Google Play, right? All of these pieces that you are familiar with on a consumer side. Google is putting more and more emphasis in adopting enterprise requirements into GMS. So be it security, be it being the ability to update devices, or in fact providing a framework called Android for Work, which is now Android for Enterprise, that basically enables the backend administrators or developers to utilize all of these capabilities. Now, the point that I'm going to raise here, which is GMS abstraction makes app development easy. So app developers increase leverage of GMS services such as Firebase cloud messaging. Cloud messaging is one of the key components in GMS, which essentially allows you to do text messaging or just messaging back and forth between an application and such, right? So again, think of it as a signpost that the developers are also adopting, or they are embracing what Google is doing, from a GMS perspective. Now, this remember I just said that it's a career-changing move, right? It's to go from Windows to Android. So it is a short-term disruptive, but it's a long-term positive. What we have seen is that this shift or this disruption that has happened from Microsoft to Android, the enterprise customers are actually re-evaluating what their application has been, right? Because it's been a decade that they've had the same applications or same workflows. And so now if you look at the newer operating system like Android, that gives a much better improved UI, things people are much more comfortable using. Remember I showed that pattern, right? That with virtual keys people were able to be a lot more effective and do a lot faster data entry. Larger screens and friendly rendering. And of course, from an application perspective, that there is a lot more visibility and increased use of manageability and analytics. When you think about the older architecture and older platforms, analytics was never really a big play, right? People never really thought of what kind of data that you can collect and what kind of patterns and trends that data is telling us, right? All of this stuff is now happening because of the shift that is going on into this next generation. Let me pause here for a second. See if this makes sense or if there are any questions.
It really upsets the old IT mentality, doesn't it? Consumer driving the path, not industry, if you will.
Absolutely. Well, think about it, right? The guy who's using the device on a day in and day out basis, right?
Right.
They should have a say in it. They should be able to tell.
That's not how it used to be.
We told them what they had to do. So it's interesting. We have this software called Savannah, right? That we Zebra is just recently coming up with. Using Savannah, we actually had one partner who wrote an application to tell within the business workflow where people were not doing things. So our traditional approach has been that this is the way it is, and this is what you have to do. That's it. No questions asked. If you have a problem, tough luck. Okay. So we can actually show the productivity improvements or decline, because if someone is not doing a task because either it's too difficult, or they don't understand how to do it, or maybe that it's too much data that they have to capture or too much stuff that they have to look at, we can tell all of those patterns and essentially enable the administrator or even the app developer to think about how to do something different. Because look, at the end of the day, if the worker is not using the device and it's not following the workflow, it's actually hurting the business itself, right? Because the most interesting things that I've seen about Zebra devices is that people would go hide them in warehouses. Why? Anyone wants to venture a guess?
They liked how their device worked.
Absolutely. And if the device doesn't work, I am off for the day, right? Okay, so, well, that's obviously not a good behavior for the organization, right? So those are some interesting patterns that come out of it. We had another interesting story where people would deliberately go hide the devices under the boxes in warehouses, right? So the battery dies, and now you have no idea where this device is. So in some of our next generation devices, we are actually going to incorporate a technology where when the battery goes down, the device will turn into a beacon. It will start transmitting that, hey, this is the last time I connected to this access point. This is the last time Ritesh used this device. And this is the last time this is the kind of data that was scanned, right? So then we can essentially go track and find out where it is. But those kind of things we never really thought of in legacy days, right? So it's just it's a very different kind of a shift. Okay, now why modernize legacy platforms, right? So of course we know that mobile platforms are reaching end of life, right? But this, by the way, this again data is from VDC, and this was the question that was asked is, what is the user satisfaction with existing line of business mobile solutions? And so if you look, this is interesting, right? So majority of them were either somewhat satisfied or dissatisfied, right? There's only very few population which was actually happy with how their line of business applications worked in past. So this, to me, is an indicator that the user itself is asking us as a corporation or the enterprise to think about, hey, what can you do to make my life easy, right? Now, modern UI experiences also drive business gains, right? So we talked about the virtual key versus physical key, right? But look at the productivity, 15 to 20% gain in productivity. And it's not just because they are used to their consumer devices. Yes, that's one big thing, right? But it's making it much more easy. So one of the best applications that I saw in world of Windows was this application where you had to scroll left, right, up, and down, right? Because it was actually an application that was designed for a desktop, and the developer basically went from a desktop version this big to 320 by 240, right? And the user was required to scroll and find things and where they had to click and whatnot. You look at the modern application designs, much more simpler, right? Much more. There is so much more emphasis on UX, right? I mean, in legacy operating systems, did anyone ever care about UX? Never, right? It's the user's problem to figure out how to enter data, not mine, right? Especially as a developer, it's not my problem to figure out, how the user enters the data. But as we see more and more modern applications, right? There is an inherent expectation that if you have an application on a modern device, like your own personal cell phones, that it'll be easy to understand, that you can easily use that, right? So if you were to, let me ask a question. So if you had to use, if you had to play Angry Birds or Pokemon Go, did anyone ever read a manual as to how to play Angry Birds? No.
Parents maybe?
Parents maybe, right? But the whole idea there is that it was intuitive, right? So we see that huge shift happening because of this migration from the OS perspective. Okay, so from Zebra's OS perspective, we will continue to support Microsoft, right? We are not giving up on Microsoft in any way, right? Our strategy is that we will continue support for Windows Mobile, Windows Embedded Handheld, till the mainstream support has ended. Here's an interesting perspective. When you look at even today, if there are any issues, if there are any bug fixes and such, Microsoft and Zebra work very closely together to figure out what those issues are, and Zebra actually provides engineering support to resolve those issues. So the thinking is that if that is the case, well, can we continue to support the customers who really want to be in a world of Windows? As I said, Zebra still has a 45% user base that still uses Microsoft, right? So that's a pretty significant user base. So we will continue to support those guys. And then, of course, our second pillar of the strategy is that we are embracing Android and moving, well, we have pretty much moved all of our portfolio out into Android. Now, of course, when we went into the direction of Android, we had to provide MX, right? And MX is simply just an enterprise layer on top of Android. It is not a proprietary Zebra operating system by any means, right? It basically, in fact, it sits in the corner. If you don't want to use it, it won't do anything. It'll just sit idle, right? It's actually for free. It's not something that has to be installed. So that's our second pillar. And our third pillar is to enable cross-platform application development. So in a cross-platform application such as HTML5, there is no more dependency on any operating system, right? Be it Windows, Android, or whatever the case may be. So what this means is that the developer today has a choice to make, right? Would you stay in Windows, knowing what we just saw about Windows and the future where that is going? Would you stay in Android, or would you stay in the cross-platform world, right? So this is where the choice really comes in from an application developer perspective. So when you look at, just to reiterate, from a Zebra portfolio perspective, pretty much all of our mainstream products have gone into Android. From Zebra's side, we believe in providing devices, accessories, utilities, and software solutions that essentially fulfill the entire ecosystem when it comes to the enterprise solutions. Now, we also have something called Mobility DNA, which provides business tools, productivity tools, management tools, and development tools that essentially enable the developers, the backend administrators, as well as users to be able to utilize the Android platform much more effectively. Now, one interesting thing that always comes about is, well, what's going to happen in the long run? So if you think about Microsoft, right? Microsoft did new versions of operating system like once in a blue moon, right? So Windows Mobile 6. Went from 5.0 to 6.0 to 6.5 and no 6.5.3 and then 6.5, right? So I think it was the other way around maybe. But when you look at Android, every year there is a new flavor of the desert, right? Now, here's a fun story, right? So we actually went to Google and said that, okay, so we know M stands for marshmallow, N stands for nougat, O stands for Oreo. We do not know what P is going to be, what dessert, but anyone knows what dessert Z would be. I cannot think of any dessert that would be named Z, right? I mean, we actually Googled it, right? Because there is no dessert by the name of Z. So we, of course, asked Google that, hey, what are you going to call Z? What dessert are you going to call it as? And Google's response was interesting, which was that we never expected that Z will actually even happen. Because to go from P to Z, even if there is a new flavor that comes out every year, that will be over 15 years before we get to Z. So now that right there is an interesting shift in dynamics, right? Microsoft operating system was there for 15 years, right? Even decades, right? But on a Google side, their thinking is that, well, okay, every year we have a new version, new flavor, new things that are coming about. Those are awesome for consumers, right? As a consumer, I love that there is new dessert flavors that come out. But for enterprise, that creates a havoc, because enterprise is essentially once you have something done and settled, you don't want to mess around with it. You don't want to change it. And so this is where Zebra actually comes and provides. There are two components that we provide. One is security, and the other one is lifecycle. Security is the bigger piece, right? Because you've heard about, as I was saying earlier, Heartbleed and all of those things. But there are other things such as rooting a device, right? By the way, rooting a device is absolutely the worst thing that you can do to an Android device. Should not ever do any sort of rooting, and especially on Zebra devices, if you were to root a device, what would happen? Any ideas?
What is rooting a device?
Rooting a device is basically taking a super user access, right? And basically removing all of the Zebra user level permissions and giving all of that to a user, right? So basically hacking into the operating system. If you were to root a Zebra device, there'll be no more warranty on that, right? So that's a pretty big thing. Okay, so when we talk about security, there are three things that are key component and what Zebra provides: prevention, detection, and security updates. Prevention, obviously, if you cannot see the application or if you cannot execute an application, well, then can really the user do any harm, right? So if I cannot access, so if I put the device into a kiosk mode, right? In Windows, it used to be App Center, right? If I use the same kind of a model for Android and the person cannot log or see the application, Does it make a difference? Think about the device, the phones that you have. If there is an application that you do not see as an icon, do you even know that it exists? Right? It might already be there, but you don't know about it, right? So the first thing is prevention, right? And then also tightly control what application has access to do what. Detection, this is where if there is a problem, if there is a vulnerability that has been discovered, what do you do with it? It's like that ad, right? That ad only tells you that, hey, there is a problem, but I'm not going to tell you the solution. I'm only here to tell you there is a problem, right? So this actually part is about not just detecting, but also figuring out how to resolve the problem. And then the security updates. So Zebra works very closely with Google to provide all sorts of updates. So for example, Heartbleed, which was one of the biggest security threat that came out from, against Google, which essentially impacted about 95% of all Android devices, right? This was, Google actually said it as open heart surgery for Android, right? To fix that. Zebra had a fix for that issue in 5 days, right? So that is really the key component there. Now, some other trends that we see that customers ask for long service life expectations, right? Just like how we expected from Microsoft. So more and more expect people, more than 58% of people, the enterprise customers expect over 5 years of life expectation from devices. So this is where the lifeguard comes into play from Zebra, right? That essentially extends the life cycle of the operating system and the device. Frequent OS updates, right? So if you look at the very first version of Android that came out, which was Cupcake, going all the way to Nougat, right? All of this stuff. Anyone wants to guess how long of a time period this is between Cupcake and Nougat?
5 years.
This is about 8 years time difference, right? Now compare this with Microsoft, right? One flavor of operating system ran forever, right? So when those kind of updates happen, this is where Zebra again provides Lifeguard to ensure that there is a life cycle availability for that. Growing number of vulnerabilities, which is more and more people essentially are finding issues with Android. And by the way, every day you hear about someone finds a new threat with Android. Zebra actually has a team of dedicated people whose job is nothing else but to research those threats and find their solutions, right? Now, why are those, especially from a security perspective, why is that important? By the way, this is a study came from Department of Homeland Security. And this was about, when you look at the mobile devices, what kind of things that basically someone can go and hack, right? What kind of things that they can exploit? Mobile applications, physical systems, networks, and technology stack, right? These are the key things. But if you look at what were the three main themes that came about, was most important defense against mobile device security is to ensure devices are patched against the publicly known security vulnerabilities, right? So that's number one thing. Now, can anyone tell me how many times that you had to do any sort of patching and security updates in Windows?
0.
Right. Okay. So that's a problem for Android, right? Okay. So, but Android is Google is very actively working to make sure that those things are addressed. When making decisions, enterprise should seek clear commitment from device vendors that security updates will be provided in a timely manner, right? This again makes it very, very important for those Android devices to be alive in ecosystem for enterprise. And device model is no longer supported with updates. Enterprise should decommission those devices. Okay, I said earlier that we still have DOS devices sitting out in the environment, right? So, well, that's not a good thing, right? So what does that mean, right? Now who needs updates? So these are just some of the examples of threats and things that came about from Android, right? Meltdown, crack, Blueborn. Anyone remembers Blueborn, right? Which actually just came last year. And then WannaCry. WannaCry was one of the best ones, of cyber attacks that came about, right? For each one of these different pieces, right? Zebra actually had a patch for them, right? And again, this is a whole point is that, in fact, actually, even if you look from a Google perspective, Google very closely monitors each one of them, right? And they again work very closely in figuring out, how to fix these security threats. Now, this is where the security lifecycle comes into play from Zebra in the shape of a lifeguard, right? Which basically is extending the lifecycle of the device. Lifeguard basically gives security. It extends how long the security patches can be applied. So, for example, when the flavor of operating system goes away, because Google will support only 3 years for a flavor, right? Because remember, they are looking from a consumer perspective. Zebra with Lifeguard will actually extend that life cycle all the way up to 10 years at the maximum, right? So that is a huge difference on that. Okay, so after all of these things, life for customers, when you think about from an operating system shift, service life is key, right? As to how you would make sure that that device is going to continue on. Enterprise life cycles are longer than processor OS support, right? People expect those devices to last for long. So again, this is something that Zebra is providing. And future promise to support a suite of comparable to mobility DNA. And this is again how to convert that consumer operating system into enterprise. Okay, so this is an interesting slide, and I think this is my last one. So I'll leave this one for discussion. So we looked at why are consumers asking for Android today, right? And these were some of the interesting patterns. So we saw that Android has an 80% market share, right? So that is, so when you think about it from a device manufacturer perspective, or sorry, from an operating system perspective, that's it. They have won that race, right? By the way, here's an interesting piece of thought. Microsoft traditionally has been always late to the game, right? When it comes to technology, they were always behind. So I'll give 3 examples, right? So first example, how many people remember Netscape Navigator? Anyone remember Netscape Navigator, right? What happened? Microsoft threw $1 billion, and with Internet Explorer, they went right up ahead in the ecosystem, right? And they were the leading providers of the web browser. Do you hear about Netscape Navigator now? I tried to install it and it won't even work. Okay. Second pattern. Anyone remembers the Java programming language from Sun back in the day, right?
Gosh, yeah.
What happened? Microsoft dropped another $1 billion, came up with .NET, right? And very quickly, I shouldn't say quickly, it took a while, it transformed the developers to move from Java to .NET, right? I mean, this transformation happened in 2004, 2005, right? Where the first time when .NET came out, I was the biggest, I was like, there's no way that I'm going to ever use .NET. I'm a Java guy. Well, now I'm a .NET guy, right? So another example, where Microsoft threw lots of money to, come up to speed. Third pattern is Microsoft spent, about $2 billion to buy Nokia, right? To drive the consumer operating system. But what happened this time is there were 2 other big gorillas with very deep pockets sitting in the ecosystem. Those big gorillas, they are, one is Google and the other one is Apple, right? So when you think about from an operating system perspective, Microsoft, or from a technology perspective, Microsoft didn't really have a choice to to throw another $1 billion and catch up with the technology this time around, right? Now, Java is again back as the most #1 popular language. So I guess I have to forget .NET and go back to Java. There are 180 plus device manufacturers who are building 550 devices in US alone running Android, right? So just imagine from a market penetration perspective, where Android is going. We did this study of our channel partners as to, what are they suggesting to their customers. And 59% of our partner community said that they are telling the customers to go Android, right? Again, huge shift, right? Because remember, the channel community for Zebra used to be all Windows, right? Because that was the only choice, right? Actually, I take that back. They had another choice, which was Palm. What happened to Palm? Anyone knows? Palm OS? Has anyone used? Gone, right? Android is installed over 1 billion devices, right? So again, just think about the breadth of where this operating system is, right? Number one OS supported by silicon microprocessor vendors, Qualcomm, TI, Intel, MediaTek, Marvell, they all support Android, right? So again, that makes a huge impact. And from an app store perspective, over 2 million plus applications, which are on the Google Play Store, right? So it again makes it very compelling from an operating system perspective. Let me pause here for a second and see if there are any questions or thoughts, or this makes sense.
Can you give us some guidance? I always find, if it's a new mobile application, it's pretty clear.
Yes.
Like Android. But where I see customers a lot of times that I would struggle is they have they may be in a regulated environment, medical,
Sure.
HIPAA rules.
Of course.
Right, they got a legacy app that's been supported for
Absolutely.
Since time began.
Yeah.
They're struggling with how do I get from here and justify the cost to move because Microsoft decided to advance.
Absolutely. Well, not only that, there are people who have written millions of lines of code, right, over the last decade, in Microsoft operating system, right, be it in .NET or focused, for Windows applications. For those kind of scenarios, the choice is to use a cross-platform application such as Xamarin, right? Because Xamarin would essentially enable them to take a lot of their .NET native code and push that towards Android. Now, I must warn that it's not a one-to-one plug, right? Because it depends on how the application was written. Because if so I'll give an example. I saw one application where it was one screen. That's it. It had everything crammed into one screen, and you just had to scroll up and down, right? Well, that kind of stuff does not fly very well, in a transformation perspective, right? So that's one mechanism. The second mechanism, something to think about, is that a class is a class. By the way, class is the programming term, right? So for code, compiled code in Windows, right? So when you create a .NET application, it creates something called a class. It's the same exact thing that Java creates. So my point is that if you have a developer who is a .NET developer, for them to move into Java, it's very, very easy. However, the point still comes into play that, hey, I still have this IP that is sitting in all of this code that I have written over the years, right? So what we have seen is that there is this shift to go towards Xamarin. By the way, who owns Xamarin? Microsoft, right? So there is a shift to go towards Xamarin to bridge the gap. But then, as people are doing that, they are also realizing that, this is actually a good time for me to think about how to redo this whole thing, because a decade long of IP might not be the right thing to do for the next decade. Make sense? Yep. It's interesting because as a developer, it's very confusing as to which direction to go. Because when we went from Palm to Windows, Microsoft guys said the same exact thing, right? Palm is garbage. Who's going to ever use Palm? Forget about Palm. Rewrite your application in Windows, right? And that was what, 10, 15 years ago. And now we are saying that, well, okay, Microsoft, forget Microsoft. Rewrite your application in Android, right? Now, the question that comes about as a developer is that how do I know that Android will be around, right? Because Palm disappeared, Microsoft disappeared. Is Android going to disappear as well? And to which I respond by saying that, remember 1 billion devices running Android, right? Google is not looking at Android as their core money maker, right? Their core money maker is data. And Google is not like something that will just evaporate overnight, right? Because these guys, they have actually thought it through from end-to-end perspective, right? So the fact that they will evaporate or disappear in the next 10 years or 15 years is, I can't say that it's impossible, but it's probably improbable, right? It's not going to happen. Okay, so if I would summarize, so Microsoft, the legacy operating system, Microsoft has ended mainstream support. Zebra will continue to support that, right? We are not leaving any of our customers behind in that. We will continue to do that. Windows 10 IoT mobile enterprise. This is a huge shift for Microsoft, to go towards the enterprise. However, the fact that 0.7 market share, it still creates a questionable future as to where that would go, right? If Microsoft will still keep on investing it. Did anyone hear the news about GitHub, right? Microsoft bought GitHub for $7.5 billion. Now, you might be wondering what GitHub is, right? GitHub is essentially an open source software repository, right? So any developer on the planet who basically creates any open source software, they load it up into GitHub. By Microsoft buying that entire thing, where do you think that IP is going? With Microsoft. So the pattern there is that Microsoft is going more towards on-prem and cloud services, right? Their more play is towards software services, as an example. On the other hand, we have Android, which is driven by market demand, right? Android continues to evolve, be it from a consumer perspective, but then focus more on enterprise. And then, of course, we see a lot more major handheld vendors now support Android. So, and of course, from Zebra perspective, we are 64% market share in enterprise. Android, the fact that Google is investing into something like Android for enterprise and Android for work before that, tells me that Google is getting serious about Android, especially for enterprise. I was telling someone the story here earlier, right? Oh yeah, actually. So the first time we went to Google, right, saying that, hey, we want to use your operating system in our mobile devices. They asked, who are you guys? And why you here? Like, what's enterprise? Why? Because remember, 219 million units and 5 million units. 5 million units is probably a molecule, for Google or those kind of operating system manufacturers, right? Because remember, their focus is towards that 219 million devices, right? But the fact that we see Google shifting their focus towards moving and supporting that enterprise business is very, very promising. Okay, I think that was my last slide. So let me just stop there. Any questions? Does this make sense?
Josh, I have a question.
Of course.
So, in healthcare, what we're seeing is from a supply chain warehouse to industrial perspective,
Okay.
the conversation is shifting towards Android.
Yeah.
From a clinical point of care perspective, it's iOS.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously I know this is about Windows.
Of course,
Android.
sure.
But has your team or any of your research looked at, and we've obviously gotten presentations as well, from a clinical healthcare perspective, point of care, why iOS is so prevalent?
Yes.
Because it's a battle that I face every day when it comes to like the TC51.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and we can obviously talk about this later.
No.
But that's something that, from a healthcare perspective,
Absolutely.
is a big challenge.
Yes. And so let's try to understand why. So actually, I'll tell you a fun secret, and then I'll answer it. So my previous life, I was actually a medical student, right? I'm actually a med school dropout, and I spend enough time in hospitals and yes, so not a lot of people know that, right? So I spent a lot of time, in ER and hospitals, and looked at what the background processes were. When you are in a medical environment, you do not have the time to putz around with technology or figure out how this is going to work or that's going to work, right? The basic thing that comes down to is that any medical provider is very comfortable and used to their mobile devices, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
They are comfortable using their cell phones, like their iOS phones or even their Samsung phones, right? And so their expectation is that when I open up or touch this device, right, whichever device it is, 51 or 56 or whatever the case may be, that it should behave exactly the way that the iOS device works, right? I should not have to, and so this goes back to that other point about the UX, right? Because that's what the expectation is, that I want that UX to be so easy that I can focus more towards the patient than the technology.
Right.
Okay. Now, what are we doing? What is Zebra doing about this? Is that we are essentially looking at what we can do from a workflow perspective to make that healthcare provider's life easy. Mm-hmm. So, as an example, we can tell based on the location of the device where that healthcare provider is in the hospital. And so let's say if 3 of us are in this area, we will combine the three of us into a work group so we can communicate to each other based on the patients that are over here.
Right.
Combine that with RFID as a technology, for instance. So we are working with Hillrom and Stryker today to integrate the guts of our mobile computer into the bed itself. So when a patient has a RFID tag, that tag gets married to the bed.
Right.
So now you know that who Ritesh is, because that bed knows. The same bed also interfaces with any of the other peripherals, like the heart rate monitor or blood pressure monitor and all of that. So now, as the healthcare provider comes to the patient, they no longer have to even look at what the surrounding things are, right? All of that data automatically comes to their handheld or to their visibility. So it's all about making that entire workflow simpler and easier to understand. And it's interesting because my aunt is a doctor, and I, by default, this is, if you are techie guys, you will know this, you become a de facto techie support, right? If you have anyone in the family who has any technical devices. And she loves her cell phone, which is iOS. Why? Because the interface, right? And I actually created the exact same interface in Android. She loves it, right? Because it's easy to understand and easy to navigate around.
Right.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I wrote
Yep.
down the statistic that you put where 58% of customers expect a greater than 5-year life cycle.
Yes.
Because right now, I have obviously an iOS device in front of me. I replace it every 2 years.
Why?
Because, well, I had a 5 that worked great, and then they came out with the new updates, and it like blew up my phone.
Okay, so right there. So that right there is actually the core thing
Yeah.
for enterprise, right? Because we in enterprise, we do not expect those kind of things to happen because we want that life cycle to be very, very long, right? By the way, why does Apple or Samsung do that? Any ideas? Like, why do they want you to buy a new device every 2 years?
Drive sales.
Yeah.
Exactly, right? Please finish.
No, that was it. I think security is a big one too.
Yes.
Obviously, when it comes to HIPAA compliance, but yeah, I just wanted to have a conversation because it's a huge challenge that we're seeing just from a clinical perspective.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that iOS is in the immediate thought. A lot of our ISV partners.
They go in that direction, yes.
Yeah.
However, so when we talk about HIPAA, the iOS device is actually not fully secured
Right.
device, right? So from a data protection perspective, those capabilities are not inherently built into iOS. Again, why? Because it was designed to be a consumer operating system, right? It was never designed to be an enterprise-grade operating system. And so that piece is a huge problem. Now, it again goes back to the user, right? Do they knowingly ignore that, right? Because that, hey, I'm so used to using it on my home life that I don't care, if it will actually have any other cause and effect otherwise, right? So, but it's an interesting dynamic, and I completely,
Talk about it for hours.
absolutely, we see that
Yeah.
constantly, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Any other thoughts?
Well, just to kind of build off that, you're talking from a medical perspective.
Yeah.
I come out of a distribution environment.
Right.
Okay.
We're a distributor. And even going back to kind of the statement I made earlier, and having my users drive where my technology goes.
Yes.
And my outside sales force, for instance, why can't we have iPhones? Why can't we have iPhones? Well, because the tools that you use and are provided don't run on iOS. Well, but iPhones are cooler, they're neater, they're better, but your tools don't work on there. And finding that
Mindset.
mindset.
Yeah.
That,
Sure.
sure, I understand where you're coming from,
Yeah.
but the tools that you rely on every day don't work on
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we have customers come back to us every, like, they'll have iOS devices for maybe 2.5 years, maybe 3, and it's just not working.
Right.
And they don't roam as well within the 4 walls of the hospital. So there are definitely benefits to Android, but it was, like I said, it's a challenge just for the point of care area from a clinician in the BYOD perspective.
Absolutely,
So-
absolutely. It's interesting because just to add on to what you just said about we've seen customers who have made a U-turn and come back to us, right? Because we've had I'll use an example of a pretty large retailer. I won't tell you the name, but it starts with L, right? And these guys, they were long-term Microsoft guys, right? And they decided that, you know what, we're going to go iOS, right? Same exact point. It's cool, right? Everyone knows how to use it. We will put a case around it, rugged case around it, and voila, right? Oh, and guess what? If you break it, you drop it, I have a carrier contract, that will replace it, right? Okay. The same customer ended up spending about 2.5 times their budget on devices. What happened? First, those devices would grow legs overnight, and they would instantly run out. Secondly, any of the OS updates, right? Here's a fun story, actually. I was in Hong Kong about 3 weeks ago, and I get out of the plane, and my phone is like crazy hot, right? I mean, I have a Samsung phone, so the first thing that goes into my mind is that this thing is going to explode, right? Okay, so now, mind you, I am roaming, international roaming, and I look at the phone, and it is downloading a gig of OS update. Now, I don't need to tell anyone, especially my boss, that if you are trying to download a gig of data while roaming international, that's not cheap by any means, right? That is an example of what happens in a consumer operating system, right? You do not have a control over when Apple decides to send out an OS update. Another interesting one, how many of you remember that when Apple actually went from, when they changed the connectors, right? They went from the big connector to the small connector. Exactly. What happened? Overnight, all of the accessories that people had created, right? They went poof. Same situation happened from iOS 6 to iOS 7, I think it was, right? I think it was iOS 6 to 7. It was such a drastic shift that people's application just broke instantly, right? I mean, the same customer whose name starts with L, half of their devices evaporated overnight. And when I mean evaporated, their application just crashed instantly, right? I mean, their operations basically came to a halt, right? And so those are the kind of things, right, where consumer operating system or devices do not fly in enterprise, right? And those are the things that we have to explain to the customer, that they understand that, yeah, this is where, things can backfire. Any other questions? Okay. See ya.
Thank you.
No problem. Helpful, useful?
Great.
All right. Hey.
Awesome presentation.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Sure.